Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and today we're going to talk about how the medal lineup is upside down once again after the COTAstrophe last weekend.
Do we even keep any McLaren assets in our team after that catastrophe?
The road to recovery once again starts right now. So, Zach, we've got to start by talking about it. That lap one disaster in the sprint, it took out both McLarens and Fernando Alonso. Then fast forward to Sunday, only one retirement, and it was Carlos Sainz. So all in all, we had the top constructor hit twice, the top 2X driver and extra DRS boost teams, and the two most likely drivers to gain value, all recording DNFs. How do we pivot into a team that we can trust for Mexico?
Very hard. That's how it's gotta be. It was a nightmare in COTA. Honestly, that's the only way to put it. Like you mentioned, purely because the top two drivers that everyone was looking at of Alonso and Sainz, and because they looked good in the sprint quali as well as looking good for budget, with them crashing, it just did not work out for us. Now, we can work around this. Of course, there have been some B-tier drivers come out of the ashes, like Bortoleto, like Lawson, that we can work around. But this weekend, it's slim pickings for who we can pick. Ocon's down there. You can't use him. He needs 32 points to go up 0.6 million. You've got Stroll, Hulkenberg, Sainz, Hadjar. They're all in very similar positions. So for me, it's you have to kind of get rid of all of them. All means necessary.
The one driver that has me worried now is Oscar Piastri. And even though that incident wasn't his fault, he hasn't topped 20 fantasy points in 3 straight races. He heads to Mexico, where his 2 finishes were both P8. So he's trying to overcome a lot of headwinds all at the same time. So I'm probably avoiding Piastri as much as I can. And throughout the show, I think we're going to talk about whether or not we can even trust the McLaren constructor after a fantastic season that they've had so far. Now, the one driver on this list I do trust at DNF is Carlos Sainz, because he has a really good history at Mexico, won this race last year, he's coming on 2 straight front row starts, and he has that 5-place grid penalty. I actually think that might be a positive as such a high overtake circuit, so Sainz might actually stay on my team this week.
From the downfall of so many other drivers at COTA, a few have looked good now. Verstappen, I think, for the first weekend in a while now, 100% is the guaranteed 2 times driver everyone needs to have on their team. I mean, he's just looked phenomenal in the last few races, and I expect him to continue this trend heading into Mexico. Then you also have 2 drivers that people tend to forget about in the B-tier driver options of Kimi Antonelli and Yuki Tsunoda. Now, Tsunoda got 37 points and Antonelli got 22. And considering they weren't ideal races for both of them, like Tsunoda had a bad qualifying, Antonelli had a little collision and then had to recover throughout the race, they still showed that they can pick up those points. So now, especially in a world where the B-tier drivers aren't really giving us those guaranteed 0.6 millions, potentially there's a way that we go to the differential of, well, maybe instead of having Piastri or Russell as the second 2A driver, maybe you could get both Antonelli and Tsunoda to cover the likes of a Russell or Piastri, because they're getting the points needed, and it makes things very, very interesting, especially with those high budgets. And then also the likes of Behrman and Bortoleto I'm quite excited about, because they just look very, very solid compared to everyone else right now. So I'm really excited to see what they can do in Mexico, considering they're both rookies. It'll be their first time there, but we shouldn't have anything too crazy happening.
Red Bull's really turned the corner here. Verstappen, since those upgrades in Monza, 45 or more fantasy points in 3 out of the 4 races since, so he's clearly the number 1 driver in the game right now. Tsunoda gained 17 places between the sprint and the Grand Prix, so I think now it's time to invest in Red Bull between the constructor, Verstappen, Tsunoda. I'd be happy with any of them this weekend. Now, there's one driver who hasn't been fantasy relevant all year, but I do want to talk about Lewis Hamilton. 32 points in F1 fantasy, but more importantly, he eclipsed 5,000 championship points in his legendary career. So, Sir Lewis, congratulations. As always, if you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe. The FanAmp channel just hit 16,000 subscribers this weekend, so we just want to extend a special thank you to everyone. Also, keep an eye out for our memberships, because you would have gotten this video a few hours before everyone else did.
A certain aspect we really need to be aware of, especially in F1 Fantasy for points, is just how many overtakes we get at each track. Now, at Mexico, It's quite a mixed bunch. Over in 2022, we only had 24, but then since 2023 and 2024, we've had 121 and 87. So it definitely looks like it's on the higher end of the overtakes. And this is where we also come back to the likes of Behrman, who I'm very excited about this weekend, purely because he's in that range where you can use him, and he is our overtake leader this year. So someone like him could really thrive around a circuit like this. Also, we mentioned Carlos Sainz earlier. Anyone who will be qualifying lower has a good chance to get quite a few overtakes and quite a few points. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially as these days the 2 times option we need, our B-tier drivers getting close to the end of the season, are so vital.
I really like Ollie Behrman this week. You had mentioned 14 points at COTA. He's our overtake leader on the season. He needs just 1 point to gain 0.2 million as well. So he's really the total package. Haas and Ferrari both looked really good at Mexico last season. So there's something to be said about that Ferrari power unit at the high altitude of this circuit. We've also got Alex Albon and both Aston Martin drivers among our overtake leaders on the season. I'd say everybody but Lance Stroll we could co-sign having on your team this week. And I just want to double click too on those drivers that start toward the back of the grid. We saw Piastri with a great recovery drive last season. He qualified P17 but had 13 overtakes to get all the way back up to P8. And then Max Verstappen had 8 overtakes himself while battling among the top drivers on the grid, but he dropped down to P6 because in those battles with Norris, he had 2 10-second time penalties. So Verstappen's pace here is really good as well. Keep an eye on some of the drivers you see on the screen because they're at their maximum allocation for one or more engine parts. You can see the likes of Hamilton, Tsunoda, and Antonelli all at the top of the grid, and a bunch of popular B-tier drivers at the bottom as well. So lots of opportunities for potential overtakes this weekend.
And then we also briefly need to mention the chip situation right now, because after COTA, it definitely does die down heading into the Mexican Grand Prix. However, the same sort of chips are still being talked about, like Limitless. Limitless, realistically, we're getting such big budget teams, you just want to use it whenever you can. So Mexico and even heading into Brazil are great options. However, again, more on Mexico, realistically, I think this is more of a wild card track. Because if you really want to use a big chip in Brazil, you want to get your team set up, ready, prepared for it. If you're using the likes of Limitless, a no negative, an extra DRS heading from this race. And then one final chip you could use in Mexico probably would be Final Fix. But again, it would have to be if we saw something like Piastri last year, qualifying badly, coming up the grid. Only way I could really see the Final Fix being used. Then for the rest of the season, it just depends on what you have left. If you've got extra DRS, you might want to consider where you're going to use this. If you have Limitless, do you use it before the extra DRS or after it? It's the same conversations we've been having all season, and nothing else has changed so far.
The season's really turned the game on its head in terms of when we use our chips. So if any of you used no negative at COTA, I want to hear from you in the comments because you have a high five coming in. Before we move on, I just want to tell you about a great event that our friend Chris McCarthy is hosting on November 11th. It's the second edition of Setting Purple Sectors. And this is where he and a bunch of F1, F2, and F3 stars come together to raise money for a great charity called Young Epilepsy. Join Chris and the likes of David Croft, Harry Benjamin, Jack Crawford from Formula 2, and Roman Belinsky from Formula 3 as they have teams of sim racers competing against one another for some great prizes. Keep an eye out on the Setting Purple Sector socials and take a look at that QR code on your screen if you want to attend.
So now heading into our tier list for the Mexican Grand Prix, again, as per usual, a lot has changed. So heading straight into the buy section, you could have noticed something that's surprisingly missing, and it's a lack of orange. So I'll get to them in a second, but as I've mentioned, Verstappen, 2 times option, pretty much a lock. I couldn't see much changing throughout the week, saying that Verstappen isn't the go-to guy this weekend. And then you also have George Russell. I think this is more because he's looked consistent. Like, he's had 35 points in Singapore, 24 points in COTA. He's just an all-round decent asset to hold, and considering he only needs 25 points to go up 0.3 million, he's also a good budget option. That is then when we have to talk about the McLaren duo. Now, do I think that they are still going to get some good points? Yes, but now we have to start considering, are those points worth the guaranteed minus 0.3s? Considering now that they're not winning races, they're getting very close points to the Ferrari drivers. George Russell, sometimes Kimi Antonelli. And you've got to think, okay, with how much money they cost, is it now worth having them in my team? That's why they're on the fence, because they still are good options and they will get you guaranteed good points. But now it's not a guaranteed 2 times option. So we've got to flesh out and think how it affects the rest of our team. Considering as well, this helps with the constructors. That's why Red Bull and Mercedes are locks as well, because they are still such good assets for budget increasing. Red Bull looks really good with Verstappen and Tsunoda right now, and Mercedes is just dirt cheap. And then it's the same issue. McLaren, I still think most people will have. McLaren is still a good asset to hold, but now that they don't have these guaranteed wins and how much they cost, it's a thing you have to work out in your brain to make sure you're not screwing over the rest of your team.
And Zach, one driver I resisted the urge to make a buy with Charles Leclerc. Definitely made a believer out of me at COTA last weekend. He's on 2 straight P3 finishes at Mexico. And this is a race we mentioned earlier his teammate Carlos Sainz won. So I think this could be a Ferrari positive circuit. And I don't mind him as a differential to George Russell because they're at very even cost right now. So for those of you that are chasing teams with Max and George, I don't mind Leclerc this weekend. Also, welcome to Tier A Williams Constructor. We haven't had a shift since Antonelli moved over several months ago, so it's good to see that there's still some movement amongst their tiers. Now over onto Tier B, it's getting crowded in the buy section because there's a lot to love here. Even the likes of Alex Albon. He's not great for budget, but double-digit points in 7 of his last 8 races. We've got to give him the proper respect. We've got Yuki Tsunoda now up to the buy category after his first price gain of the entire season. Red Bull should be good this weekend, so I think with Yuki as the only driver with negative points to gain 0.6 million, he's a great buy for us. One thing I will mention, because I've been the wet blanket on Fernando Alonso all season, 6 DNFs on the season, negative scores in 3 out of his last 4 races, 3 straight DNFs in Mexico. So be careful with Fernando, even though he has a tempting cost cap gain.
Yeah, especially the buy section, it's just really interesting because you can also block them off together because you've got the likes of Gasly and Colapinto who are the hold assets. They look pretty good for decent budget increases, but basically the end all for them is they can't go down in value. You also have the 2 underperforming, well, used to be underperforming drivers, Antonelli, Tsunoda now right there with easy options to potentially get a lot of good points. You have Behrman and Sainz who look good for overtake points. There's multiple different venues you can go about using these B-tier drivers, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses. But like I mentioned earlier, because of how just close it is in the B-tier drivers, with Tsunoda realistically being the only dead set riser on budget, you can really just work around it and really focus on the points this weekend.
So let's bring it all together and talk about our top lineups from Mexico this weekend. I know a lot of you are going to be asking about the knee-jerk reaction to COTA, so let's show it right here. Red Bull, Ferrari, Verstappen, Russell, Alonso, Colapinto, and Lawson for 131.2 million. I know this is a spot that a lot of us can afford. I would just be careful about some of your transfers. We only have 2 or 3 heading into this weekend. It'll be a lot of movement around the constructors. So if you have 3 or 4 of these assets already and 3 free transfers, this could be a good way to pivot around. But like Zach mentioned earlier, think 2 steps ahead to Brazil and how you'd get out of it if McLaren are back on the upswing.
Yeah, I really love these foundations of teams now because we have drivers where you can easily swap out as well. Like if you really do believe in the Ferrari hype, you really can just go Russell to Leclerc and it's a straightforward swap. You can easily replace Lawson with a Bortoleto if you need a little bit more money there. You can also drop Alonso down to a Gasly. There's a lot of movement in these teams, but yeah, like Adam mentioned, realistically with these teams, it's can you reach them? And then also, is this going to be the meta for the rest of the season? I don't think so. I still think McLaren are going to be both in the top 5 most race weekends, which will make them a better constructor than most. And then going off sort of what I was just talking about, this is where you bring in McLaren. Now, I really, really love the look of this team. And I love how it's called the Maybe Better, because it is. You got to think to yourself, really? Verstappen and Russell? But that is the way that it looks like it could potentially be huge. Verstappen, Russell, Alonso, Bortoleto, Colapinto, McLaren and Red Bull. McLaren and Red Bull, I think, look like they're both the strongest constructors heading into Mexico. Like I mentioned, I'd be surprised, unless there was another DNF, touch wood, that McLaren both weren't in the top 5. And in Red Bull, Verstappen looks like he'll potentially win. Tsunoda looks like he could get into the top 10. I'm happy with those. And again, the beefier drivers holding from Colapinto and potential increases from Alonso and Bortoleto. And the great thing is, you can easily swap these teams around. Let's say you can't afford Red Bull, just drop it down to Mercedes and it's still a very good lineup. Then again, if you go from McLaren to Mercedes, you could also increase Alonso up to a Sonoda and go that route. So there's different routes you can go for budget or points. But this team, it just looks phenomenal.
And this, to me, I think is the biggest pivot for teams like Zach that can afford McLaren, Mercedes, Verstappen, and Piastri. They had the incident in COTA. Now you can just switch this team around, get a piece of Red Bull and Russell, smooth out your Tier B drivers, and it's a great way to pivot and rebound nicely.
And then coming a bit back down to earth from those high, big budgets, for everyone out there who is still not crazy on your cost cap, these are the sort of teams I would run. With Verstappen as the 2 times, normally I could say you could go for a differential play there, but I think Verstappen is a clear 2 times lock. With McLaren and Mercedes, they still look like a good pairing for those constructors. And we've basically got the best of the best on the budget and the cheap side of things for the B-tier drivers. Now, if you still can't afford this, you can drop down Mercedes to a V-carb, and then it frees up a lot of money to get back down closer to 100 million for people just starting out in F1 Fantasy. And at the same time, you can also look at going for those technically 4A light teams where you could increase Behrman up to an Antonelli if you have slightly a little bit more money. So again, I love these teams because there's a room to play around with them. But at the end of the day, this is more of a budget side for anyone who can't afford the big buck teams.
And then for those of you looking to make a climb in your mini leagues, let's take a look at this differential play because we are going heavy into Red Bull, Verstappen, and one of our biggest climbers, Yuki Tsunoda, while taking advantage of that hot streak recently from Mercedes. We are keeping McLaren on this team just because we only have so many transfers to go around here. You probably had them on your team already. They are the most popular constructor in the game, but you are going to get a lot of that benefit from Verstappen and Yuki at a circuit where I think Red Bull's going to be quite popular.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe the free A driver is the new way to go. Well, technically, free A driver.
We'll be back with our live show this Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. BST in one of our latest shows of the season. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on Saturday.
Take care, everyone.